Marcus Wright had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years when he made the decision that would change everything. On March 12, 2020, the experienced captain of Northeastern Airlines was scheduled to pilot Flight 447 from Boston to Miami with 156 passengers aboard. But Marcus had other plans. The morning started like any other at Logan International Airport. Marcus arrived 2 hours before departure, completed his standard pre-flight checks, and greeted his co-pilot, Rebecca Chen, with his usual professional demeanor. But inside, his heart was racing. Today was the day he would execute a plan he had been developing for 8 months. What passengers and crew didn't know was that Marcus had been spending countless hours in his home flight simulator, practicing a specific route that had nothing to do with commercial aviation. Night after night, he would sit in his basement, running the same scenario over and over until he could execute it perfectly with his eyes closed. Flight 447 departed Boston exactly on schedule at 9:15 a.m. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, and everything seemed routine. Marcus maintained normal radio contact with air traffic control as they climbed to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Rebecca noticed nothing unusual about his behavior during the first hour of flight. But at 10:42 a.m., something changed. Marcus told Rebecca he was experiencing a slight headache and asked her to handle communications for a few minutes while he reviewed their flight plan. This was the moment he had been preparing for. While Rebecca focused on radio communications, Marcus quietly began inputting new coordinates into the autopilot system. His fingers moved with practiced precision across the controls, entering a series of waypoints he had memorized from months of simulation practice. The changes were subtle enough that the aircraft's course deviation wouldn't be immediately noticeable. The first sign something was wrong came 15 minutes later when Miami Center attempted to contact Flight 447 for a routine position report. Marcus had already switched the transponder to standby mode, making the aircraft nearly invisible to radar systems. Rebecca noticed the radio was unusually quiet and asked Marcus about it. "Just some equipment interference," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm working on it." But Marcus wasn't working on fixing anything. Instead, he was implementing the final phase of his plan. He had studied every detail of radar coverage gaps along the eastern seaboard, identifying a specific corridor where an aircraft could fly undetected for nearly 20 minutes. As Flight 447 began its unauthorized deviation from the planned route, passengers in the cabin remained completely unaware. The flight attendants continued their normal service, and most passengers were either reading, sleeping, or watching entertainment systems. The aircraft's movements felt completely normal from inside the cabin. Rebecca became increasingly concerned when her attempts to contact air traffic control resulted in only static. She turned to Marcus and insisted they troubleshoot the communication system immediately. This is when Marcus made his most critical decision. "Rebecca, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, his voice remaining eerily calm. "I'm taking this aircraft to a different destination, and I need you to trust me on this." Rebecca's training kicked in immediately. She recognized this as a potential hijacking situation, but the hijacker was her own captain. Her mind raced through emergency protocols, but none of them covered a scenario where the pilot himself was the threat. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" Rebecca demanded. "We have 156 people on this aircraft. Turn us back to course immediately." But Marcus had already locked Rebecca out of the primary flight controls using a technique he had discovered during his simulation practice. The aircraft's fly-by-wire system allowed the captain to override co-pilot inputs, and Marcus used this feature to maintain complete control. As Flight 447 continued its unauthorized route, air traffic controllers in Miami began to worry. The aircraft had failed to report at its scheduled checkpoint, and all attempts to establish radio contact had failed. Within minutes, the situation escalated to the highest levels of aviation security. The North American Aerospace Defense Command was notified, and military radar operators began scanning for the missing aircraft. But Marcus had chosen his route carefully, flying through areas where radar coverage was minimal and using weather patterns to help mask the aircraft's signature. Meanwhile, passengers began to notice something was different. The sun, which should have been on the right side of the aircraft during their southbound journey to Miami, was now on the left. A few observant travelers realized they were flying in the wrong direction, but most assumed it was a normal course correction for weather avoidance. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh was the first crew member to notice the unusual flight path. With 12 years of experience flying the Boston-Miami route, she knew exactly what the view should look like at this point in the journey. But instead of the familiar coastline of North Carolina, she saw unfamiliar terrain below. Jennifer made her way to the cockpit and knocked on the reinforced door. Post 9/11 security protocols meant she couldn't simply walk in, but she could communicate with the pilots through the intercom system. "Captain Wright, we have passengers asking about our route," Jennifer said into the intercom. "Are we diverting for weather?" Marcus's response chilled her. "Tell the passengers we're taking a slight detour. Everything is under control." But everything was not under control. Rebecca had been frantically trying to use backup communication systems to contact ground control, but Marcus had systematically disabled each system using knowledge he had gained from technical manuals he had been studying for months. The aircraft Marcus was piloting was a Boeing 737-800, equipped with multiple redundant communication and navigation systems. But his extensive preparation had taught him how to disable these systems in a way that would buy him the time he needed to reach his intended destination. What was that destination? For months, Marcus had been planning to fly to a remote airstrip in northern Canada, a location so isolated that he believed he could land undetected and disappear before authorities could respond. His home flight simulator had the exact specifications of this airstrip programmed into it, and he had practiced the landing approach hundreds of times. But Marcus's plan had a fatal flaw he hadn't considered. Modern aircraft leave digital breadcrumbs that are almost impossible to erase completely. Even though he had disabled the transponder and radio systems, the aircraft's satellite communication system was still sending automatic position reports to the airline's operations center. These reports, transmitted every 10 minutes, created a trail that investigators would later use to reconstruct Flight 447's exact path. But in real time, these signals weren't immediately recognized as coming from the missing aircraft. As Flight 447 approached the Canadian border, Marcus realized he had another problem. The aircraft's fuel consumption during his unplanned route deviation meant he wouldn't have enough fuel to reach his intended destination and then escape as planned. His months of careful simulation had been based on standard flight profiles, not the additional fuel burn caused by his erratic routing. Rebecca, meanwhile, had discovered that one emergency communication system was still functional. It was a backup radio system designed to work independently of the main communications array, and Marcus had overlooked it in his preparations. She managed to transmit a brief distress signal before Marcus realized what was happening and disabled that system as well. But her transmission had been received. The fragmentary message "Flight 447 emergency captain as control need immediate assistance" was enough to confirm that the missing aircraft was indeed experiencing some form of crisis. Military aircraft were scrambled to search for Flight 447, but the vast airspace over eastern Canada made this an enormous challenge. The aircraft could be anywhere within a circle spanning thousands of square miles, and radar coverage in the remote regions was sparse. Inside Flight 447, passengers were becoming increasingly aware that something was seriously wrong. The flight had been in the air for nearly 4 hours, well past the scheduled arrival time in Miami. Flight attendants were trying to maintain calm while dealing with their own growing fears about the situation. Marcus made another critical error at this point. Believing he could maintain passenger compliance, he made an announcement over the aircraft's public address system. His voice, which passengers had heard during the normal pre-flight safety announcements, now carried a different tone entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently diverting to an alternate airport due to an operational issue. Please remain seated and stay calm. We will be landing shortly." But passengers weren't fooled. Several had been tracking the flight on personal GPS devices and knew they were nowhere near any major airport. Cell phone coverage, sporadic but occasionally available, revealed they were flying over wilderness areas of Canada. Passenger David Morrison, a private pilot himself, recognized immediately that they were in serious trouble. He had been tracking their flight path and realized the aircraft was flying toward one of the most remote regions of North America. "This isn't a normal diversion," Morrison told his wife quietly. "We're flying into the middle of nowhere." Word spread through the cabin quickly. Passengers began making phone calls when cell coverage briefly allowed, leaving voicemails for family members and alerting authorities to their situation. One call that proved crucial came from passenger Maria Santos, who managed to reach her husband in Boston. "We're on flight 447 and something's wrong," she whispered into her phone. "The pilot is flying us to Canada, but this isn't where we're supposed to be going." Her husband immediately contacted the FBI, providing them with real-time information about the aircraft's status and passenger conditions. This call established that Flight 447 was not a case of mechanical failure or navigation error, but rather a deliberate hijacking by the pilot himself. The FBI's response was swift and comprehensive. Within 30 minutes of receiving the passenger's call, they had established a joint command center with Canadian authorities, military officials, and aviation experts. The case was designated as a potential terrorist incident, triggering extensive resources and protocols. But Marcus remained unaware of how thoroughly his plan had unraveled. His months of preparation had focused on the technical aspects of flying the aircraft to his chosen destination, but he had underestimated the speed and effectiveness of modern emergency response systems. As Flight 447 approached what Marcus believed was his target airstrip, he faced another devastating realization. The remote landing field he had identified during his research was covered in snow and completely unusable. His simulator training hadn't accounted for seasonal conditions at the Canadian location. With fuel running dangerously low and nowhere to land safely, Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. The aircraft was carrying 156 passengers whose lives depended on his ability to find a suitable landing site immediately. Rebecca, who had been monitoring their fuel situation, finally managed to break through Marcus's psychological state with a direct confrontation. "Marcus, we have less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining. If you don't find a place to land this aircraft immediately, everyone on board is going to die, including us." The reality of the situation seemed to snap Marcus out of whatever mindset had driven him to this point. For the first time since beginning his unauthorized deviation, he appeared to understand the full consequences of his actions. But it was too late for a simple reversal of course. Flight 447 was hundreds of miles from any major airport, flying over terrain with limited landing options, and carrying barely enough fuel for one landing attempt. Marcus's pilot training finally took precedence over whatever had motivated his hijacking. He began scanning for any possible landing site, including highways, frozen lakes, or any flat terrain that might accommodate a Boeing 737. Meanwhile, rescue teams were mobilizing across eastern Canada. The fragmentary position information from the aircraft's satellite communications had provided a general search area, and military aircraft equipped with advanced radar were converging on the region. The first visual contact with Flight 447 came from a Canadian Forces CF-18 fighter jet, which located the aircraft flying at low altitude over the remote Labrador wilderness. The fighter pilot immediately reported the aircraft's position and condition to the Joint Command Center. "Target aircraft appears to be descending and searching for landing site," the fighter pilot reported. "Terrain below is heavily forested with no apparent suitable landing areas." This information was relayed to aviation experts who began analyzing potential emergency landing sites in the area. Their conclusion was grim: there were virtually no safe options for landing a commercial airliner in that region. But Marcus had spotted something the experts missed. A frozen lake, approximately 2 miles long and relatively flat, appeared to be his only option. Landing a Boeing 737 on ice was incredibly dangerous and had never been attempted before, but Marcus concluded it was their only chance of survival. He announced his intentions to Rebecca, who began preparing the cabin for an emergency landing. Flight attendants moved through the aircraft, instructing passengers on emergency procedures and preparing for what could be a catastrophic impact. The approach to the frozen lake was unlike anything Marcus had practiced in simulation. He had to estimate the ice thickness, wind conditions, and braking effectiveness on a surface no Boeing 737 had ever touched before. As Flight 447 lined up for its approach, passengers could see the wilderness below and understood they were attempting something unprecedented. Many were making final phone calls to family members, while others sat in silent prayer. The landing itself was a masterpiece of piloting skill under impossible conditions. Marcus managed to touch down on the frozen lake surface and bring the aircraft to a stop without casualties. The Boeing 737 came to rest in the middle of a Canadian wilderness, but all 158 people aboard were alive. But their ordeal was far from over. The temperature outside was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the aircraft's engines had failed during the landing sequence, and they were approximately 50 miles from the nearest road. Rescue helicopters arrived within 2 hours of the landing, guided by the fighter aircraft that had maintained visual contact throughout the emergency. The evacuation of all passengers and crew took nearly 6 hours due to the remote location and harsh weather conditions. Marcus Wright was arrested the moment he stepped off the rescue helicopter. FBI agents had been waiting at the Canadian military base where the evacuees were taken, and Marcus was immediately taken into custody. The investigation that followed revealed the shocking extent of Marcus's preparation. FBI agents who searched his home discovered the elaborate flight simulator setup in his basement, complete with detailed charts of remote Canadian airstrips and extensive notes about radar coverage gaps. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators analyzed the computer files from Marcus's flight simulator. He had practiced the hijacking scenario more than 200 times, refining his approach and timing with each simulation. The question that haunted investigators was simple: why? Marcus Wright had no apparent motive for hijacking his own aircraft. He had no criminal history, no financial problems, and no known connection to terrorist organizations. The answer, when it finally emerged during FBI interrogations, was both shocking and deeply disturbing. Marcus had been suffering from an undiagnosed psychological condition that created elaborate fantasies about heroic rescues and dramatic escapes. In his distorted thinking, Marcus had convinced himself that hijacking the aircraft and successfully landing in the wilderness would make him a hero. He believed passengers would be grateful for his flying skills and that he would be celebrated for saving their lives from a manufactured crisis. Mental health experts who evaluated Marcus concluded that he had developed what they termed a hero complex, a psychological condition where individuals create dangerous situations specifically so they can resolve them and receive recognition. The legal consequences for Marcus Wright were severe. He was charged with multiple federal crimes, including hijacking, endangering the lives of passengers, and interfering with aircraft navigation systems. His pilot's license was permanently revoked, and he faced life in prison. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Marcus's extensive premeditation, including his purchase of the flight simulator equipment, his study of remote landing sites, and his systematic practice of the hijacking scenario. The defense argued that Marcus's psychological condition should be considered a mitigating factor, but the prosecution successfully demonstrated that his months of planning showed clear understanding of his actions and their consequences. Marcus Wright was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that while mental illness might explain his behavior, it could not excuse the terror he inflicted on 156 innocent passengers and their families. The case had lasting impacts on aviation security procedures. Airlines implemented new psychological screening requirements for pilots, and aircraft manufacturers developed additional safeguards to prevent a single crew member from gaining complete control of an aircraft's systems. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the recognition that the greatest threats to aviation safety might come from within the industry itself. The Marcus Wright case demonstrated that extensive background checks and regular training weren't sufficient to prevent a determined individual from exploiting their position of trust. The passengers of Flight 447 filed a class action lawsuit against Northeastern Airlines, arguing that the company should have detected Marcus's psychological instability through more comprehensive evaluation procedures. The airline ultimately settled for an undisclosed amount. Rebecca Chen, the co-pilot who had tried desperately to regain control of the aircraft, was hailed as a hero for her actions during the crisis. She continued flying commercially but required extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of the experience. The frozen lake where Flight 447 made its emergency landing became an unexpected tourist attraction. The aircraft itself was eventually recovered and transported to a facility where investigators could conduct a complete examination of its systems and damage. Analysis of the aircraft's data recorders provided investigators with a complete timeline of Marcus's actions during the hijacking. The recordings revealed the chilling, calculated nature of his behavior and his complete disregard for passenger safety. Perhaps most disturbing were the cockpit voice recordings from the final minutes before landing. Marcus could be heard talking to himself, apparently believing he was about to become famous for his piloting skills and heroic rescue of the passengers. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts became a template for identifying similar threats in the aviation industry. Marcus Wright's case study is now used in training programs for pilots, air traffic controllers, and security personnel. The families of Flight 447 passengers continue to deal with the lasting trauma of their experience. Many required extensive therapy to overcome the psychological effects of believing they were going to die in a remote wilderness. 5 years after the incident, documentary filmmakers produced a detailed examination of the Marcus Wright case, interviewing passengers, investigators, and aviation experts. The film highlighted the vulnerabilities in aviation security that allowed one individual to endanger so many lives. Marcus Wright himself has never expressed remorse for his actions. In prison interviews, he continues to maintain that his piloting skills saved everyone's lives, apparently unable to acknowledge that he was the one who endangered them in the first place. The case remains one of the most studied incidents in aviation psychology, demonstrating how mental illness combined with technical expertise can create unprecedented threats to public safety. Marcus Wright's story serves as a reminder that the human element remains the most unpredictable factor in aviation security.